Today, I'm going to do a lecture on the nuclear age, the atomic bombs, and the end of World War II. So you're going to want to pause this to set up a notes entry, and throughout the lecture, you're probably going to need to do some pausing so that you can write stuff down and maybe rewind and write down some of the things that I'm saying, because I'm going to say a lot more than is actually written on these slides. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we have here is a map of the world at the start of World War II. And the main thing that I want us to look at and focus on with this map are the two areas that are highlighted in black. So this is important because World War II was fought in two different hemispheres. So there was Europe and then there was Asia. And so we normally and mostly hear about the war in Europe with fighting Hitler and Germany and the Nazis, but there was a whole other part of the war that we don't always learn as much about, and that was Hitler's ally in Japan. And so we were also fighting in Asia and in the Pacific as Japan's empire was spreading. Okay. So the last time we talked about a president, we talked about FDR, and FDR was president throughout the Great Depression, and he was also president throughout most of World War II, but not all of World War II. So he dies, and he has a stroke, and so Truman becomes president in 1945, and he has only been vice president at this point for like 80-some days. So he has very little experience in high office. He isn't really ready. He's thrust into this situation and he's got huge shoes to fill. So Truman is now in charge and Roosevelt is no longer president. And so after Truman has been president for only like 1 month, so Truman's been president for 1 month, and then Germany surrenders. So that's what this is a picture of, is one of Germany's generals surrendering. And so after Germany surrenders, then all of the focus shifts and all of the focus goes from being like divided between Europe and Asia to now we're only focused on Japan. So now we've got a different map. This is after Germany surrenders. So I'm gonna click back to the other map so we can see this a little bit better. But Japan's empire has spread pretty far, especially south and into like the Pacific and into those islands. So Japan has grown like literally in terms of size, but also in terms of power. They've become a pretty strong empire. So let me click back here. Okay, so there's Japan's empire towards the start of the war. And then after Germany surrenders, we can see that spread towards the south. So now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Japan and their leaders and what they were like during the war. So there's two main people when we think about Japan during World War II. There's Emperor Hirohito, who was like the face of Japan. He was the one that was like communicating with the public. He was the face of the empire, but he wasn't really making a lot of like military and strategic decisions. That fell to Prime Minister Tojo. The Prime Minister was the one who was really doing all of the decisions and really kind of running the show behind the scenes. Emperor Hirohito was much more of a figurehead. And so in Japan, I want to talk about the culture for a little bit. So in Japan, there's a big, deeply ingrained belief, especially in the military, of honor. And having honor means that you don't give up and you keep fighting. We see this in several different ways. We've talked about like kamikaze pilots before who are willing to give up their life and crash their plane in order to further the cause for Japan. And so this caused America and our leaders like Truman to be really afraid that Japan was never going to surrender, that they would never give up, even if they were clearly losing, and that this war would go on and on and on, and that Americans would keep losing lives as well. And Japan, they were really horrific. The Japanese committed lots of war crimes throughout and prior to World War II as they grew this huge empire. And one of the major examples of this is called the Nanjing Massacre. It's also sometimes called like the Rape of Nanjing or the Rape of Nanking. This was a period of 6 weeks when Japan was spreading into China and taking over land in China. And so the death count is estimated, it's not exact, but it's somewhere in the range of 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese people who were murdered, and somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 Chinese women that were raped throughout this 6-week span. And during this period, there was also a pretty horrific competition. You can see the man pictured with the sword. There was a competition between a couple different military leaders to see who could kill 100 people first with only a sword. And this competition was like publicized in newspapers, and it was like covered like almost like a sporting event in Japan. So that just kind of goes to show the way that the Japanese military was conducting itself and how the people were responding to it. So it was pretty horrific, and so we don't want to kind of gloss over that. It was a really big deal. Okay, so that was some background on the state of the world, on Japan, on where things are at. Now let's move back and talk about the US and what the US is doing in response to having to fight Japan, who they don't think is going to surrender, and fighting Japan, who is committing terrible war crimes. This is where we get to the Manhattan Project. So the Manhattan Project lasted for about 5 years, and it was a secret government program. So the public didn't know about it, other countries didn't know about it, and this is how the atomic bombs were created. This map shows us all of the different locations throughout the country and even up into Canada where this project was being executed. So where testing was happening, the different labs, all of the different places. And if you look, there's even a place in Dayton, Ohio, where this project was happening. This is a picture of an atomic bomb explosion. So when an atomic bomb detonates, there's this massive mushroom cloud. So you've probably seen this picture or pictures like this before. And this mushroom cloud goes so high, it goes above the plane that dropped the bomb. So this is Robert Oppenheimer. He was one of the main people of the Manhattan Project. And this video is him describing what it was like when the test went off. So when they first tested the atomic bombs, he talks about what he felt, what he was thinking about, and then how other people reacted. So in a minute here, I'm going to ask that you pause this lecture and go watch this video that's linked in the daily agenda. But before you do that, I want to run through pretty quickly what it is that he is saying, because you'll see the way he speaks is very haunting. So I want you to actually watch it, but it's a little hard to understand because it's an old video. So I'm going to go through what it is that he's saying. So first, he talks about how people react. So he says when the bomb went off, when we saw the test, he says some people laughed, some people cried, most people were silent. And then he starts talking about what he thought and what he was thinking about when he saw the test. And so he thinks about a piece of Hindu scripture, and he thinks about this god whose name was Vishnu, and Vishnu is trying to convince a prince to go and do his duty. And in order to convince this prince, Vishnu, this god, says that he takes on his many-armed form. And then Vishnu says, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. And Oppenheimer says that in that moment when they saw this atomic bomb go off, that was how he and how they felt, all of the people there. They felt like they had become death, destroyer of worlds. So now if you could please pause this video to go watch that one so that you can actually see him say this and see kind of his tone and his face, and then come back to this lecture after you watch it so we can finish. Okay, hopefully you paused, you went and watched Oppenheimer. I'm going to continue on with this. Okay, so the US does drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan in 1945. The first one is on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th, and the second one is on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th. So there's only 3 days in between the two bombs being dropped. And so that is not giving Japan very much time to react and to decide what they should do, whether they should surrender or what should happen. But the US goal is to get Japan to surrender. So they dropped 2 atomic bombs in very close succession to each other. And it worked. This does get Japan to surrender. They surrender on September 2nd, so the following month, to the US. And so this was really important. After Germany surrendered, after Germany is out of the war, all of a sudden the Soviet Union can then also focus on Japan and get involved in Japan. And the US didn't want that to happen. The US wanted Japan to surrender specifically to the US so that we would have more power and more control in the post-war world, and then the Soviet Union would have less power and less control. So that is exactly what happens. Japan does surrender to us, to the US, and it's because these 2 atomic bombs were dropped that caused this surrender to happen. So that is it for this lecture. Like I said, if you need to go back and rewatch some sections so that you can get your notes kind of fleshed out and make them complete, that is great. And make sure that you do go and watch that Oppenheimer video. And as always, email me if you have any questions or if you need anything clarified from this video. Thank you guys.